Again, everything started with the promise that God made to Abram in Genesis chapter 12, that God would make him a great nation and that through him all the families of the world would be blessed. From that promise, just a few years later, God made a covenant with Abram. So it went from a promise to Abram to a covenant with Abram, that a child from his own body would be his heir and that he would give the land that Abram was living in from the Nile River to the Euphrates River to his offspring. But in the middle of that promise and that covenant was also this information, that your people will leave this land and they'll be in bondage for some 400 years. So for 430 years, God took Abraham's family and forged them into a nation in Egypt, in the land that God referred to as the iron smelting furnace, which means God didn't turn it around, God turned it on. Right? It doesn't mean that things got hot and God cooled it. It means that God turned up the heat because there was something that God was doing from the very beginning. This is another of those places where we have to yield to the fact that we don't understand God's ways. How could a famine that drove Jacob and his sons to Egypt, that led to generations of slavery, be God's plan for fulfilling his promises to Abraham? How's that possible? Because we think famines are the work of the enemy, somehow trying to destroy us. And yet what we see in Scripture often is that a famine can become a harvest of the eternal if we turn our attention from what we're losing to the God who's in control. God's always doing more than we can see and more than we understand. He's always doing more than we think we need and more than we could ever ask or imagine. But we must remember that God's ways are higher, His love is better, and His grace is sufficient. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 is a passage that we sort of kind of flirt with more than we actually cling to. Right? Like we talk about the thorn in the flesh and we're all trying to figure out what it might be so we can figure out what ours might be. And then we get to this place of, but your grace is sufficient. But here's what has to be understood. If grace abounds, that means that God's always giving grace. Right? It's always being given. There is an unending faucet of grace coming down from God to man. But if grace is sufficient, you know what that means? God's always giving enough. That means in whatever situation you and I ever find ourselves in, we can be sure of this. In this moment, God is giving enough. Because not only is it persistent, it's sufficient. And so I've got to learn how to believe that if He's giving what He says, I have what I need. His grace is enough. I don't have to go plead for something I'm missing. I have to cling to what I've been told I will always have. His grace is sufficient.